So welcome everyone to yet another Zoom session of the group. It's great to see you all here in this difficult time, difficult now for more reasons. If the pandemic wasn't enough, now we have, well, it's actually a good thing. I think the other crisis that's hitting the world, well, particularly the United States, in that it's bringing something that's always been there out into the open, to a head, so to speak. So the talk today will be dealing with what I've called mindfulness or practice, insight meditation practice in a racialized world, or how we relate to what's going on around in the world, in terms of the racism that's present, in terms of white privilege that's present, in terms of what we do with what's going on. So how does this practice, how does insight meditation affect how we relate to social injustice, and specifically racism in the world? How does it affect it? Is this just an internal practice? You know, we sit on our meditation cushion, we see the mind, we get to know the mind, we get to know how perceptions form, how, you know, touch our true nature and so forth, and then we get up and go about our day and nothing changes? Or does this practice, you know, at our core shift how we move about in the world? So I want to talk about it in terms of awareness internally, how that shifts, and how we practice internally, but also then how we practice externally. We practice internally and we practice externally. And so I'd like to talk about both of those aspects, and I'd like to frame it around you know, a couple of ways, specific practices, but also then how we relate, you know, the two truths, the ultimate truth, ultimate reality, and relative reality, and how those can, how important they are to recognize them and know how we interact with and between them. I want to give voice to the fact that I'm a white man, a white guy, giving a talk on practice in a racialized world and how to relate to racism, and I'm not speaking from the experience of someone who's experienced this kind of racism. I've seen it, and I've heard the stories of people who have shared in dealing with it, and I've practiced as an ally in my life in terms of being an ally to those fighting the injustice. But just to put that out there, that I am speaking from the standpoint of a white man, heterosexual, able-bodied, getting old, but not quite there yet. So just to put voice to that, that reality and the importance of that, the standpoint from which I'm speaking. So the awareness internally, we're talking about being aware of our conditioning and aware of our biases and prejudice that arise, and how that then might affect our behavior. So that's part of what I want to talk about. The other part is how the practice can provide new and effective ways to engage in the world. Just to give you an example, we talk in this practice how it creates a pause. There's a space between stimulus and response because we're aware. We're not on autopilot. It's just not stimulus response. Stimulus. There's stimulus, awareness, response, not stimulus reaction or reaction. And in that space, options emerge in terms of how we engage in the world. Wise options based on clarity. So this practice really does open up this way of engaging in the world. So I'd like to speak about both of those aspects. Won't get into too much into the whole concept of engaged Buddhism, which was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh and is a way that we engage in the world, and it's very much a well developed way that he practices in the world. I did learn a lot from him, and it will inform the talk. I also should point out I've I had a teacher, Joanna Macy, who I've learned a lot about, who learned a lot from and about her in terms of her work around social change and fighting injustice in the world. So also to point that out. So internally, how can the practice help us understand how we're conditioned? How can we face our conditioning? How can we see? We don't know what we don't know, right? So with this practice of insight meditation or vipassana practice, mindfulness practice, the translation of vipassana is seeing clearly from all sides. So seeing what we don't know is very much a part of that. Seeing what we don't know. So in this stillness that we cultivate, this quiet, the stillness, the calm that we cultivate in this practice, that can arise as we still the body and we sit. We can see how we relate to thoughts. We can see perceptions arising. We can really see the mind-body complex arising. We're not just at the mercy of it, not just thrown about. When a thought arises, we follow it. We actually see it arising. We see its nature, its character, and we can uncover so much in that process. We can uncover, for one, our blind spots, what we don't see. We can uncover another teacher I've learned, who's very much Rebecca Bradshaw at Insight Meditation Society. She's been very much engaged with Dara Williams and others for over a decade, opening Insight Meditation Society to being more inclusive, bringing diversity into the organization. So I've heard her say so many things over the years around this that have been helpful in my practice with it. And she said, we may see that all perceptions are conditioned, but not see how this creates an unconscious bias that could cause us to act unskillfully. So we're seeing how these perceptions that are arising can create this kind of unconscious bias, prejudice, prejudged, that can then cause unskillful actions in the world. We can also see, so that's one part of it, seeing our conditioning, the perceptions that are arising and how those how they do create biases. We can also touch, and we've really emphasized this in these sessions, and I think this is why the practice of resting in natural awareness resonates so much with me in my practice, is that it's touching that what I was referring to in the guided meditation, our true nature, that inherent, boundless kindness and compassion that's there, that we forget about, and it gets lost in the hustle and bustle of our daily life and gets clouded over by thoughts about, self-centered thoughts about, why me, or how am I going to, just that, although that cascade of thoughts and stories that arise, it gets clouded over by all that. So it's just this coming back and letting, that's in the meditation, it's just letting all that be, letting all that content and flurry, really, it's at times, letting it just be, and touching into what's underneath all that true nature, that sense of kindness and compassion. When we touch that, and that's an internal practice, that can be, it's boundless, that can be endlessly, boundlessly put forth out into the world. And that's really the gift of this practice to the world. This compassionate engagement with the world. And of course, this is in Mahayana Buddhism, Zen, which is where Thich Nhat Hanh's from, and other Mahayana, they talk about the bodhisattva ideal, which emphasizes this kind of union of wisdom and compassion, the two wings of the bird of wisdom and compassion. And really, the motivation for the practice is not so much personal liberation, but practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. And you'll hear the Dalai Lama saying the most selfish thing you can do is practice kindness, because it fosters, it makes you happy. So it's got that, the bodhisattva ideal, you can also see how that is a way to come at this practice of engaging in the world, practicing for the benefit of all beings, not just for our personal awakening. And in fact, they're I don't see them as mutually exclusive. They're intimately intertwined, mutual. Kenneth Kraft has an interesting quote. I'll read it. An exclusively inner transformation, however profound, is not the end of the trail. Greed, anger, and delusion need to be uprooted in personal lives, but they also have to be dealt with as social and political realities. So the individual transformation is not the full story. We're also looking at how the greed, hatred, and delusion are also rooted in society. They have to be dealt with. I know that's I think I've heard the term, or maybe it's social dukkha, so to speak. How to deal with social dukkha. Yeah, this is a hard one to talk about. It's difficult for a few reasons. I remember hearing Joseph Goldstein again talking about how they've dealt with this issue at Insight Meditation Society. I remember him telling the story where they IMS, I think it was probably like almost 15 years ago, they had their first people of color retreat. And not very far into the retreat, he called it, he said there was a revolt. And what had happened was a group of 5 or 6 white teachers put together the first people of color retreat. And he said, I'll use his words, he said, I was clueless about that, about the inappropriateness of that. And of course he allowed himself to feel the discomfort of realizing he was clueless, and allowed to learn, to be shaped and enriched by the dialogue that then ensued. And he said it was one of the most enriching things he's done in his practice, and he's done a lot, was seeing this and having the conversations around it, and then changing how then the structure, because that's a structural issue, of who's designing the retreat. One of the most enriching things he did was seeing how internal seeing can be applied in the outside world, and how important it is to being in that engagement in the outside world. Yeah. The other part of this is the ethical practice. It's part of this training. So the Eightfold Path, which is the 4th Noble Truth, basically the path that we're instructed to follow, the 8 elements. 3 of them are ethical: right action, right thought, right livelihood. So that's very much how we engage in the world, this kind of ethical ways of, and they're trainings, right? They're never presented as commandments. They're just be aware of how we engage, so that we can learn and grow as we sort of figure out how to navigate the relative world ethically. I've always said, and I've had some lively and healthy debates with other teachers around this, but I've always said the Buddha's a revolutionary, was a revolutionary. The fact that he was teaching in India 2,600 years ago, I guess at this point, and there was no caste, the caste system where you had the untouchables up to the Brahmins. There was no caste in his Sangha. So if you're going to join the Sangha, you had to let go of any identification with caste. Well, that to me is pretty radical in those days. I can imagine that, I can just imagine how radical that would have been. And then, of course, women, and this is sort of perhaps where the debate gets in, and again, a man talking about women's issues, but the Buddha really, from what I see, tried to bring equality into the Sangha between men and women. Of course, there isn't that now, and from what I've seen, it's that inequality, or really the subordination of women to men within Buddhist hierarchical, the Buddhist hierarchy came about after the Buddha. These are all brought in by other people. And I who knows if that's 100% true. It's a nice thing to think that, that that's how it happened. But I do believe, given from other things I've read, is that was the intention. So I kind of see him as a revolutionary. Now, he didn't talk a lot about social dukkha, and I think you can kind of understand he was in an era where there were authoritarian rulers and I'm trying to see how that might fly in an authoritarian government today. I won't name any names in terms of places, but we started talking about injustice and struggling against social dukkha. In his era, I can imagine he would be cut off pretty quick. So that's, so I've got off on a tangent, but I just sort of want to sort of paint the picture of how important this is to the practice. And I think I might risk saying that I think it's been neglected in insight practice circles. It really warmed my heart to see so many of you come tonight. I had a story that kept popping up in my head, that because I sent out the email a couple of days ago saying I've changed the talk, and I had this story that kept playing saying nobody's going to come. Nobody's going to want to, because we emphasize so much in these sessions the internal, that maybe people aren't going to want to hear about the external, and engaging with the external. So it really warms my heart to see you all here. So how does this, I'm going to have to move along. How does this manifest? How does insight meditation help us become more effective in the way that we address social injustice in the world, however that arises for us? And that'll arise from your practices, that the internal work that you do. I would like to say it's kind of a process of transformation together, because of interbeing, non-separation. It's really a process of transformation together. There's a quote that I used many years through many times throughout my life is, I believe it's an Aboriginal person from Australia that said it: if you have come to help, then don't bother. If you see your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. That just, to me, says that's so much Dharma right there. Right? So it's not and that's how I guess I've operated as well. Let's transform together. Let's have these conversations and transform together. And this involves, for me personally, seeing my white privilege, seeing how that plays out in my life. And it can be so subtle. I can go for a jog with my fighter who's also white. We go for a jog together. I don't think about who's in front and who's back. We just jog. I was hearing about a white woman who's married to a black man. And she said, he can only jog in front of me. Because if he jogs behind me, he's afraid somebody's going to think it's a black man chasing a white woman. It's completely out of my realm as a white male. We just jog, and so it's seeing how that privilege plays out in society. It plays out in the courts, policing, government, in so many ways. In Canada, it's very much how First Nations peoples are experience society. The U.S. It's right now it's so much speaking. So much of the dialogue is around blacks. In Canada, the dialogue needs to be around First Nations as well, very much so. Like, we have the story where a First Nations person is much more likely to be pulled over by the police, is much more likely to be charged, is much more likely to plead guilty because they don't have access to legal help. They're much more likely to plea out the case and not go to trial. They're much more likely to be given a longer sentence. They're less likely to get parole. And so we have the situation where we have so many First Nations people disproportionately in our prison system. So I won't go on too much more about the structures. I mean, that's for you to investigate the very real nature of structural inequality with so many peoples in society. So I spoke before about this pause. So if you're following along in terms of recognizing structural injustice in society, how does insight meditation help us address that? And I don't mean we all have to be activists, but that could be part of it if that's what arises for you. But then how does it change how we just engage with the world? I talked about that pause between stimulus and response, in that pause, other choices can emerge that allows us to see more clearly what's actually happening in the moment and respond more wisely. So when we insight meditation teachers, and myself included, teach that we accept what arises in the moment non-judgmentally. Sometimes people think that to mean that, well, we just let everything's fine, we just let everything be, we don't change anything in the world, we're just kind of accepting. But what it means in this practice is it's not resignation. What it means is we're accepting what's it's already actually arisen. As soon as you're aware of it, it's already happened. So there's that element. So you're accepting what's happening in the moment, so that that pause can arise, and you can wisely be and clearly see what's present and proceed from that clarity. So you're not struggling with what's present in that moment. It's already happened. And without that struggle, there's a clarity and equanimity and balance that then you can bring into how you engage in that moment in the world. The ability to see what's true in that moment. Not based on preconceived ideas, but what's true in that moment at the deepest level. Before this, I listened to a talk as it was unfolding in the world, the protests by Ruth King, a Black woman Dharma teacher, and she pointed out the two truths and how the importance of understanding the relationship between ultimate truth and relative truth. The ultimate truth being kind of the formless, the empty nature of phenomenon, including our sense of self, that kind of formless, and the relative being the forms, the conditioned, these bodies with all the sense experiences, what Ram Dass used to call the spacesuits that we walk the earth in. So that understanding the difference between and the interaction between this ultimate reality and this relative. So in the ultimate reality, there is no race, there's no fear about race, there's no anger the formless. In the relative, we're all conceptual projections and beliefs based on delusion and ignorance. And there is racial ignorance and race in this dimension, in this reality. And now in our practice, we get glimpses of the ultimate reality. We get glimpses of our true nature. In fact, these glimpses often is what brings us to practice. And often what, for some, motivates us to continue to practice. It keeps us on the path. And in living in this relative world, sometimes it's easy to forget the ultimate, and we see ourselves as separate beings. And of course, in the ultimate reality, where there's no separation, there's interbeing, so kind of oneness. And from that, I take how important it is to practice in the relative world in order to see the ultimate. T.S. Eliot has a quote, the eternal is outside of time, but it is in time that we see the eternal. The eternal is outside of time, but it is in time that we see the eternal. So it's in our engagement with the relative that we see the eternal. We have to be touched by the relative world in order to see the ultimate. So why am I saying all this? It seems like a long preamble to pointing out how engaging in the relative world and what's going on in the relative world is so crucial to this practice. We need to be, we're being touched. It is by being touched by the relative that we see the ultimate. Another teacher that I've mentioned here several times is Sayadaw Tanjania, who has brought that particular approach to the insight meditation practice that we've played around with here. He said that people only become awake when they experience discomfort and distress. Well, if you feel a little discomfort and distress in talking about these kinds of issues, then, and talking about white privilege, then that's good. That's a good thing for the practice. It's enriching. It's enriching the practice. I think I'll end it there. I've got some more things I could say, but I'd like to leave it open for some dialogue and any questions. Then you'll have to unmute yourself to ask a question.
So when it comes to issues of social injustice, I guess to me, what comes to mind, or what always comes to my mind, is that, what can I do? And for often lack of clarity on that point, I don't feel I do anything. And even if I don't buy into these social injustices or these biases, certainly by having an internal sort of belief system that I would say I embody, or I live and I share with others, that's one thing, but it doesn't never feels like it's enough. So you talked about sort of the being aspect of this, and cultivating this sort of awareness and a space to take time before, you know, experiencing and acting, or thinking and acting. But for me, the question is, you know, I mean, acting just in the day to day, but in terms of changing things, you know, what do we do? And you know, sometimes it's feel guilty because, you know, you talk about white privilege. Well, you know, I didn't do anything. I'm guilty. I feel guilty. But what do I do? You know, and beyond just not buying into the biases and being open, feels inadequate to just be some way. So where's the balance between the being and the doing to fix things?
You know, there's so much in that question that could be explored. The idea of guilt, the idea of guilt, and where that arises from. What are the thoughts that feed that storyline of guilt? So that's something to explore. You know, we could explore the concrete part of the question, as well as the notion of, you know, what can we do? You're doing a lot by being kindness and compassion in the world. It's doing a lot, and so seeing that is important. So just being is a gift to the world. So that's part of it. So that you can explore that in relation to the more, and I'll say this because I know you, I know it's a direct teaching, but the more self-centered view of guilt. You can explore the being of kindness and compassion in the world. The guilt is just a story. Now, what can we do? You know, the few people I bounced off some of the ideas, some Dharma friends about this talk, they said, "Well, I feel helpless. What can I do in the world?" And now, not all of us are going to be social activists. I mean, that's not what arises for us. Some of us, it does arise. And some of it arises at some points in our lives and not other points in our lives. It shifts and moves. So, I mean, that's okay. That's okay. If what arises for you, but not from a place of guilt, but from a place of compassion, then you can, you know, start to talk to different groups that are involved in this issue and start the conversation and see how you know, this might you know, move forward in terms of some participation. There's a big demonstration, I think tomorrow, I forget, it's like 3 o'clock or something. So there's small ways to participate as well. So yeah, it's something to explore in your practice. But really, I invite you to also explore that notion of guilt that arises.
You said, I believe, that when you accept it, and I think in your talk, Stephen, you know, it was in the context of social injustice. Anyway, I'm blown away by what you, I think, said, that when you accept it, that when you're not struggling against it, then you can have the clarity of what you might do or how to approach whatever it is. And my comment, I guess, is I think that seems to me just to answer this whole notion of why when you accept something, it becomes a different thing. Because I have, like probably most people, I get consumed by the struggle of why it shouldn't be this way. How did it get this way? All of these factors, which is the struggle against it, all of it, different ways of struggling against whatever it is. Anyway, so I just feel a little blown away with your comment, that just, I have received enlightenment, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, and I think, and can I extend that? So I am extending that, though you were talking about accept and not struggle, and then this leads to some clarity of mind about whatever it is. You were talking in the context of a social injustice, but I'm extending it to everything. May I do that? The answer is yes.
Yes, of course. You can do whatever you want.
Okay.
Yeah, briefly, we the other part of this practice is understanding kind of non-duality. We see so much of we see so much in terms of good and evil in the world. In fact, and it comes from you know, a historical, cultural, religious background of many people in this culture. And it's, you know, if you look at our movies, or there's the story of, I see two storylines: the struggle of good and evil, and the romance story. I mean, I know it's hard to find a movie, a fictional novel that doesn't have one of those two. But so that struggle between good and evil is very much entrenched, and I think this practice invites us to see past the duality, to see more in terms of ignorance and wisdom, really. I mean, that's not really a duality in that sense. So yeah, seeing beyond how perhaps we view these issues, and then that enables us to engage and in a new, in a clearer way. We're not replacing, you know, one set of injustices with another, which is so important. How many times in the world have we seen a revolution overthrowing injustice, and what replaces it is more injustice?
what I think what the past week has been for me is it has been a few things. One is trying to send out compassion, and another part has been examining my own. Um, I'll say my own inner racism in a sense, if you want to call it that. I mean, I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a colleague who's black, and telling about this dream I had about being in this alley, going down at dark at night, and there's this black man, and I was frightened, and it was such a powerful, illuminating dream, um, in a way that I had not um, kind of understood how insidious it can be, even for somebody like me, where I think I'm a progressive sort of white male. I think in terms of having to examine one's you know feeling of self in relationship to other people, and examine what sort of I guess dynamics are there, hierarchy in which I participate in, my privilege, and that's one. I'm not trying to get into a kind of a guilt scene, but just to kind of be able to recognize those 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 uh, those thoughts and impressions of the other, and seeing how I how those thoughts are there. It's a struggle, it's in that way, and I think, even from my perspective, what I find is that when I talk, but I'm very conscious about taking away a voice as well, by bringing it out too. So there's just a lot of stuff there. I almost like part of what I should be doing is just shutting up as a white guy, and you know, and just trying to be, um, you know, um, thoughtful and compassionate about it. I mean, it's a very interesting, sort of process that I'm witnessing in myself within this context.
Just the to shut up as a white guy. I, I I almost didn't give this talk because of I was scared to and the discomfort, and sitting with the discomfort helped me in a sense. I don't know if courage is the word, but I guess it is, to step out and say, okay, it's important that the dialogue happen. If I screw it up, then that's part of the learning, um, that will go into it. I'll speak my truth, and then, but it needs to be said. And I think we're at a juncture where, at least I guess I'm hopeful that we're at a juncture where I think change is imminent and possible for so many different reasons. So again, it's another reason I thought it was important to speak at this. And I'm bringing this dialogue into dialogue. I went for a 2-hour bike ride with some friends, and so what I talked about, I was just trying to keep a dialogue about it going, exploring what other people thought about what was going on and how they deal with white privilege, and what they've seen in their life and so on. So just to keep that dialogue going. And some people just don't want to talk about it, which is fine, but others were quite open to having such a dialogue.
So, Stephen, there's a Thich Nhat Hanh poem that he wrote, where he moves into various people's perception, right? And there's the young girl who's being, raped by the man on the boat. You know the poem I'm talking about? And it moves and it moves and it moves. And basically, he's basically saying all these people are us in a sense. At least that's what I'm getting from it. So we're not just one unified sort of monster, I guess, in that way. But I'm just wondering whether there's something in that that's a lesson for this process, like what we're seeing now, from a meditative perspective or a mindful perspective.
It's the poem.
Call me by my true names. Yeah.
That's it.
My true names. And it's interesting you should mention it because it's the only thing that I was able to go through by reading it almost every day, by trying to soften my excessive outrage of what's happening. Because it's not new. It's just in our backyard. It happens in Yemen, in Sudan, the Khmer Rouge. It has happening all over the world, but we don't see it. It's over there. When it happens in our backyard, it changes. And we get very upset because we see it. And so rightfully, we should get upset. But for me, I really need to read that poem every day to kind of bring me down and understand that, yes, it's all of us. We are all of that. And Thich Nhat Hanh also says, without the light, there cannot be dark. It's not just his quote, but it is part of everything, the darkness and the light, because you cannot have one without the other. I still cannot process, and I don't know how to completely deal with that internally, what I see, what I hear, and then there's Trump, and let's not go there. But it's nature, it's a human nature. We go through cycles like that. And it's not the first time, it will not be the last time either. But we can move on by, I'm trying to be kind in my community, with my family, with my neighbors. And that's really all we can do. We cannot reach out to these people. We cannot reach out to certain things and make it all go away. We don't have that power, but we can become better in our community, and the people that we know and the people that we interact with, we can show kindness and compassion toward them. And that's how it spreads, I hope. Thank you.
You're on mute.
I'll unmute you there. Oh,
I have to do it. I have to do it myself, I think,
there you
once
go.
a week. Sorry. I'm really glad that we're talking about this. I think it's really hard as white people to talk about this kind of stuff together. And two things kind of come to mind. One is that it's so hard to see from another person's perspective. Like it's so, because we're not there. Like as we don't know how men talk about women when they're by themselves, and men don't know how women talk about men because they're not there. And so we have these like private experiences, you know, and we don't know what other people go through. And so it's hard sometimes to see the systemic things that are happening, or to understand them, or even to believe that they're happening, because we don't see them. Like I can only see what I can see from my world. And you know, I think it's hard when you know, it's just hard to see from another person's perspective. And I think especially if you haven't had lived experience of poverty or racism or homophobia or misogyny, it's hard to imagine that that stuff's really real, you know. And I have a female friend, and when the whole Me Too thing came out, her husband came home and said, this can't really be happening. Like these women must be making this up. Like it just was completely outside of his understanding. And yet if you talk to most women will say, oh yeah, ever since I was a kid. Like most women can probably name 5 or 6 experiences of some pretty awful stuff. But if you don't live that, you don't know that, you know? And so I just wanted to reflect on that, and that I have been reading a lot of stuff by Black people talking about what white people can do, because I don't know myself and I feel very helpless. And there's some very practical things to know about our powers as consumers of culture and our consumers of food and physical goods that we don't necessarily know about, and we do have power to exert some influence on some of those systems that are aimed at keeping some people poor. So, and we benefit from that, or we unconsciously take part in that because we don't know, you know, through our choices about what we buy, for example. And I'm just learning about it myself, but there's you know, there's a lot that can be done to kind of look in our day-to-day lives and start to correct some of these things. So I'm learning a little bit about that. And then the one thing that I wanted to just share personally is that I struggle a great deal with anger about all of this that's happening. And I think having experienced poverty, for example, and also some pretty extreme homophobia in my life. And I think it's difficult, having been on the receiving end of that, to also broaden my view and say, okay, well, we're all that. We're all the oppressor. We're all the victim. We're all the rescuer. And it's my challenge is to kind of to see beyond the role that I see myself in. So it's not guilt for me, it's rage for me. Although I do also feel white guilt when I recognize my own privilege and the advantages that I've had. It's more the outrage at injustice that I struggle with bringing compassion to, and kind of opening and making it a bigger story. So.
I just want to add, and I'm sorry, I'm on my balcony, so if you hear any cars zooming by, that's what's going on. I don't know how much this relates to mindfulness, but in terms of a practical thing that we can do is there's, like I've used, you know, like I'm privileged, I'm white, I have the benefit of receiving a decent income, and so I have some disposable income, and there's plenty of charities that we can donate to. For example, there's a charity out of Toronto that provides legal support for people who have, for Black folk who've been accused of a crime and who maybe can't afford a lawyer otherwise. And so there's plenty of charities as well that if you want to support that, that's also an option.
So I just wanted to comment on the interest for me of the whole duality. This week, I have to admit, I've been living under a bit of a rock, dealing with the death of a pet, believe it or not, but struggling with the place of duality between, you know, the grief of losing a loved one and somehow trying to find or believe that it's okay to carry on, and that those two things can sit beside each other. And I found myself sitting and trying to hold the two of them at the same time. And that does, believe it or not, dovetail into what I'm going to say next. So I was leaving my place of work today, which is at 100 Constellation. So it's been locked down over the last 12 weeks, and you can only get in with a pass. And there are some people that try to enter the building to pay tickets or get their social checks or whatever it might be. But on this particular day I was leaving, so there was a young Black person, and when I said it, I honestly didn't think I was saying it out of any prejudice but I have to admit that, so what I had said is, oh, you may want to check in with security as you're going in this building, because I didn't recognize this person, and we've been trained that if we don't recognize anybody going into the building, that we should, speak to them about security and direct them to security. So that is, of course, what I did. But I caught myself afterwards wondering, well, if this had been a middle-aged white woman, middle-aged white man, would I have done the same thing? And it's trying to sit with that duality of, can you be both? Can it be both at the same time without being one or the other? So that's what I find myself reflecting upon this week, as to whether or not you can hold both, but still choose right action.
Just wanted to share quickly something that something that occurred to me tonight as a result of all this discussion, and I'll thank you for this. My question earlier about what can I do, I've actually, an answer has come up for me, and that is, I guess it's all sinking in, and just, the talk about, the struggle. If we struggle, then we don't see clearly, and it's all about seeing clearly and just going with the knowing. And so for me, I need to put aside the preoccupation with not knowing and looking for the right thing to do or what to do, and just let it arise, go with what occurs, and just do, and just act. And it's that simple, rather than, so to me, it seemed to me like the struggle, and put it aside and just see clearly and act. And it's pretty simple. So I'd share that.
Thank you for the thank you for the dialogue. I appreciated it. I'm cognizant of the time and that people have other things to do in the evening. One side of me would like to just continue, and maybe we can continue. I think it can add this dimension to our dialogues in the Sangha more often, and of course sort of link in with the teachings that we engage with week by week. I will move on to what we were intending to do this week, which was the hindrances, or what do we do? How do we relate to the difficulties that arise in our practice? And you can see how this relates too to what we've just been talking about. It permeates all the aspects of this practice. So again, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. See
Thanks,
you
Steve.
next week.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, bye.
Good night.
Right.
Hey.